She's been seeing someone else. I have proof. Those 9 words. My mother-in-law said them to my husband on a Tuesday morning while I was 20 minutes away, sitting across from a retired Navy captain, signing the last page of a classified case file that had taken me 14 months to build. I didn't know what Diane had done until Marcus came home that evening and set his keys on the counter without looking at me. I'd spent my career reading rooms, reading silences, reading the exact moment when someone decides the truth no longer matters to them. That night, standing in my own kitchen, I read my husband's face, and I knew. Before we tell you what happened next, drop your country and your local time in the comments. We read every single one. A few days before any of this happened, I was standing in the backyard watching Marcus grill chicken, and I remember thinking, this is enough, this right here. The smell of charcoal, the way he always burns the first batch and blames the grill, the neighbor's dog barking at nothing. This is enough. We'd been married 7 years. 7 years of him not asking too many questions and me not offering too many answers. And somehow that arrangement had grown into something I trusted completely. Marcus knew I worked for the government. He knew I traveled sometimes. He knew there were phone calls I took in the car, alone, with the windows up. He never pushed. I used to think that was just his personality. Easygoing, practical. A man who cared more about what was in front of him than what was being kept from him. Later, I'd wonder if that silence between us had been a door left unlocked. I was 42 years old. I'd spent the better part of 15 years in the JAG Corps, the Judge Advocate General's Corps, for anyone who doesn't know the acronym. Military law, prosecutions, investigations, the kind of cases that never make the evening news because the people involved sign paperwork agreeing they won't. I'd tried cases on 3 continents. I'd stood in rooms where generals lied to my face and learned to wait them out. I'd prosecuted a colonel for war crimes and a contractor for stealing $9 million meant for body armor. I was a lieutenant commander, and I was good at my job in the specific way that people are good at things that have cost them something real. I didn't talk about any of it at home. That's not as strange as it sounds. Plenty of people in my line of work keep their professional lives sealed off. Partly, it's regulation. There are things I genuinely cannot discuss. But partly, if I'm honest, it was a choice I made early in my marriage and never revisited. Marcus came from a world of blueprints and building permits and Saturday morning hardware store runs. His work was physical, visible, satisfying in a way mine never quite was. I didn't want to be the wife who turned every dinner into a debrief. I didn't want him worrying about things he couldn't fix, so I kept it clean. I kept it separate. I told him I processed government contracts, which was true enough that I never felt like I was lying. The people who knew what I actually did could be counted on one hand. Captain Harold Voss was one of them. Harry had been my supervising officer when I was a young JAG attorney, 27 years old, and still believing that the law and justice were the same thing. He'd spent 30 years disabusing officers younger than himself of exactly that notion. With a patience I came to understand was its own form of kindness. He retired 4 years before I met Marcus. We stayed in contact the way people do when they've been through something difficult together. Not often, but meaningfully. A call here, a lunch once a year. The kind of relationship that doesn't need maintenance because it's built on something that already survived. 14 months ago, Harry had brought me a case. Quietly, through proper channels, in the way things get done when official channels have already been compromised. A defense contractor, a firm with connections that ran deeper than they should have, had been overbilling the military for equipment that either didn't exist or didn't work, millions of dollars. Lives potentially at risk because units in the field were receiving inferior gear while someone in a suburban office park collected the difference. Harry knew people who knew people, and one of those people had handed him a folder, and he'd driven it to me in person because he didn't trust anything digital. I spent 14 months on that case, quietly, carefully, the way I'd learned to work. The night Marcus came home and set his keys down without looking at me. That was the same day I'd finished it. Signed the final transfer of documentation to the prosecutor who would take it to the next phase. Harry had come to the office, we'd sat across from each other, and I'd felt that particular exhaustion that comes not from overwork, but from finally putting something down that you'd been carrying too long. I drove home in a good mood. I remember the radio. I remember stopping for gas and standing in the cold for 2 minutes, watching the numbers tick up and thinking, it's done. It's actually done. Then I walked into my kitchen and saw my husband's face. Marcus was standing by the counter. It's not sitting, which he always did when he got home before me. He'd drop onto the couch or pull a stool to the kitchen island. Always horizontal, always decompressing. But he was standing, arms crossed, not in anger exactly, more like he was holding himself together. He looked at me when I came in and then he looked away, which was the thing that stopped my breath. In 15 years of courtrooms and interrogation rooms and conversations with people who had done terrible things, I had learned what it looked like when someone was deciding whether to believe you. There's a particular quality to that gaze, a flatness, an assessment, like they're measuring the distance between what you're about to say and what they've already decided is true. My husband was looking at me like that. I said his name. He said he needed to ask me something. I set my bag down slowly, the way I'd learned to move in rooms where the tension was already high. No sudden gestures, no defensive posture, just presence. I said okay. He asked me where I'd been that afternoon. I told him the truth, at the office. Then signing paperwork with a colleague, he asked me the colleague's name. I paused. Not because I was hiding anything, but because I was calculating how much I could say, how much I was permitted to say, whether Harry's name was safe to offer in this context. It was a half-second pause, barely a breath, but Marcus had been watching for it. And he found it. Mom called me today, he said. She says she saw something. I stood very still. He pulled out his phone and showed me a photograph, grainy, taken at an angle clearly from a screenshot of security camera footage. A man standing outside our house, late at night by the front steps. The timestamp read 11:14 p.m. She says this has been happening more than once, Marcus said. I looked at the photograph for a long time. I recognized Harry immediately, his height, his posture, the particular way he stood with his hands behind his back, a habit he'd never lost after 30 years of Navy life. I knew exactly what night that was. I knew what he'd been doing there, a document I'd forgotten to take from the car. He'd driven it over because it couldn't wait until morning. I could have explained all of it in 2 sentences. I didn't, because 2 sentences would have required 3 more, and 3 more would have opened a door to a room I had kept locked for 7 years. And I wasn't ready to open it standing in my kitchen while my husband looked at me like I was a stranger. So I said the only thing I could, in that moment, that's not what it looks like, and I watched his face, and I knew those 5 words were not going to be enough. Diane Russell had never liked me. I'd known that since the 3rd week Marcus and I were dating, when she'd looked at my hands across her dining table and said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "You don't cook much, do you, Brittney?" It wasn't a question. I hadn't taken it personally. Some mothers are like that with the women their sons choose, measuring, comparing, finding the specific angle from which the new person fails to measure up to something imaginary. I'd met enough of them in depositions to recognize the type. Women who'd built their identity around a relationship and couldn't afford to let that relationship evolve without them. I'd filed Diane away in that category and decided the kindest thing I could do was be consistent, polite, present without being threatening. I brought wine to her dinners. I asked about her garden. I laughed at her stories about Marcus as a boy, which were actually funny and which she told well. For 6 years we managed. Not warmth. There was never warmth, but a functional distance. 2 people who understood the terms of their arrangement and kept to them. Then, 8 months ago, something shifted. I didn't notice it at first. It started small. A comment here, a silence there. The kind of thing you file away without quite registering why. Diane asking Marcus how his week was in a way that excluded me from the answer. Diane calling him on weekend mornings when she knew we were usually together, then keeping him on the phone long enough that whatever we'd planned quietly dissolved. A remark at Easter about how she worried Marcus worked too hard, followed by a glance at me that lasted just a beat too long. I noticed. I said nothing. The dinner that really started it happened 6 weeks before Marcus came home with his keys and his flat gaze. A Sunday. Diane hosted, as she always did on the last Sunday of the month, her house, her table, her territory. Marcus's younger brother Derek was there with his girlfriend, a kind, loud woman named Pam, who talked about reality television with genuine intellectual investment, and who I liked immediately and completely. The 5 of us sat down to pot roast and sweet tea, and for the first 40 minutes it was ordinary. Then Diane asked me about my schedule. "You've been traveling a lot lately," she said, not to Marcus. To me, her fork moving in small, precise circles. "Some," I said. "Where to this time?" "Virginia, mostly." "Some meetings in D.C., government meetings," she said. The way she said it, a fraction of a pause before government, just enough to make the word feel like a raised eyebrow. "That's right. It must be hard," she said for Marcus. "All that time alone." Marcus looked up from his plate. "I'm fine, Mom. I'm sure you are," she said, and smiled at him with such practiced tenderness that for a moment I almost believed it was genuine. Then she looked back at me. "I just think it's important for a husband to feel like his home is settled, stable. I always made sure Gerald felt that way. Gerald had been dead 11 years. He came up frequently. Derek changed the subject to a project he was bidding on, and the moment passed, and Pam said something that made everyone laugh. And the dinner continued. But I sat with Diane's words the way I sat with testimony I didn't yet know what to do with. Carefully, turning them over, looking for the structure underneath. She was building something. I didn't know what yet. 2 weeks later, Marcus mentioned that his mother had stopped by the house while I was at work, just to drop something off, he said. "You know how she is." I did know. But what I found myself thinking was, what time did she come? Which direction did she park? Could she see the front steps from her car? The questions rose automatically, the way they always did, the occupational instinct I'd never fully been able to turn off. I let them go. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was not being paranoid. The week before the accusation, Diane called Marcus 3 times in 4 days. I knew because I heard his end of the conversations, low, brief, the tone he used when he was managing something he didn't want to explain. The 3rd call happened on a Thursday evening while I was making tea in the kitchen. He took it in the bedroom. When he came out, he was quiet in the particular way that meant he was deciding something. I asked if everything was okay. He said yes. He said it the way people say yes when the answer is not yes, but they haven't yet assembled the courage to say what it actually is. I didn't push. I should have pushed. In a courtroom, I would have pushed. I would have leaned in exactly where the resistance was, because that's where the truth was. But this was my kitchen. This was my husband. And I had a rule, long-standing and mostly unconscious, about not using my professional skills on the people I loved. It felt like a violation of something, like bringing a scalpel to a dinner table. So I poured my tea and I let the silence sit, and I told myself that whatever it was, we would get to it when he was ready. 3 days later, he was standing at the counter with his keys and his careful face, showing me a photograph of Harry Voss standing outside our house in the dark. I've thought about those 3 days many times since. I've thought about the Thursday evening and the cup of tea and the choice I made to wait. I've wondered what would have happened if I'd sat down across from Marcus and said, "Something is off. What has your mother been telling you? Let's look at it together before it becomes something we can't look at together." I think about a principle I learned early in JAG training from a supervising attorney who'd seen more cases fall apart than most people try in a lifetime. She said, "The truth does not protect itself. You have to walk it into the room yourself, or someone else will bring their version first. Deanne had understood that principle better than I had. She'd had 3 weeks of phone calls, 3 weeks of small, careful deposits into my husband's doubt. By the time the photograph arrived, she didn't need to argue her case. She just needed to let the architecture she'd built do its work, and it had Marcus wasn't a foolish man. He wasn't cruel or suspicious by nature, or the kind of husband who looked for reasons not to trust. He was a man who loved his mother and trusted his wife and had been quietly handed what appeared to be a conflict between those two things. And the person who'd handed it to him had been working on it for months before he even knew there was a question. I had walked into that kitchen 7 hours too late, and somewhere across town Diane was sitting in her armchair with her tea and her television, and she had no idea that the woman she'd just accused of infidelity had spent the last 14 months building an evidentiary case that would dismantle a 9-figure fraud operation. She had no idea what I did for a living. She was about to find out. Marcus didn't yell. That was the thing that made it harder. If he'd raised his voice, if he'd slammed something down or said something's ugly, I would have had something to push against. Anger I can work with. Anger has edges, and edges tell you where things are. But Marcus went quiet in a way I'd never seen from him before, a careful, deliberate quiet, like he was rationing his words because he didn't trust what would come out if he stopped rationing. He sat down at the kitchen table. He put the phone with the photograph face up between us, and he folded his hands, and he looked at me. "Mom says it's happened more than once," he said. "Marks, she says she's driven past a few times, late. She says she's seen a car she didn't recognize. She says the last time there was a man at the door." I looked at the photograph again. Harry's silhouette unmistakable to me, anonymous to everyone else. The timestamp, the angle from across the street, slightly elevated, probably from a phone held through a car window. Diane had been sitting in her car across from my house at 11 o'clock at night. The thing I felt in that moment was not anger. It was something colder and more clarifying. The feeling I got in depositions when someone finally said the thing that explained every other thing. Diane hadn't stumbled onto this. She'd been watching. She'd been waiting. She'd built her file the way I built mine, patiently and with purpose, and she'd delivered it at a moment calculated for maximum impact. I had underestimated her. That was my mistake, and I owned it in the space of about 4 seconds, and then I set it aside because there was a more immediate problem sitting across the table from me with folded hands and a face I loved and didn't currently recognize. "Who is he?" Marcus said. Still not a question. A statement he was leaving space inside of. "He's a colleague. At 11 at night, it was time sensitive. He had something that needed to be delivered in person." "What kind of government work," Marcus said slowly, "gets delivered to your house at 11 at night by a man my mother doesn't recognize?" And there it was. The question I'd been avoiding for 7 years, arriving not the way I'd imagined it. Someday? Over dinner, when I was ready, when I'd figured out how to explain it gently, but like this. Across a kitchen table with a grainy photograph between us and 7 years of careful silence, suddenly, feeling less like protection and more like a wall I'd built around something I should have shared. I could have told him everything right then. I've asked myself why I didn't. Part of it was regulation. There were aspects of the case I'd just closed that I genuinely could not discuss. Not with an unsecured civilian. Not without authorization I didn't have at 10:30 on a Tuesday evening. Part of it was the 14-month habit of sealed lips, the muscle memory of not talking, the way long practice makes certain silences feel like survival. But part of it, and this is the part I've had to sit with, was pride. A specific, stubborn variety of pride that I'd been carrying for years without examining it. I had never wanted Marcus to know what I did because I'd feared what it would change. Not his love, I trusted his love, but the texture of our life together. The way he looked at me over the kitchen counter. The particular ordinary domesticity we'd built, which I'd always known was built on a partial truth, and which I'd told myself didn't matter, because the part that was real enough. If I opened that door now, standing in the rubble of what his mother had just done. It would look like I was only opening it because I had to. And maybe that was true. And maybe I couldn't stand it, so I said, "I can't explain all of it right now. But I promise you, it is not what your mother thinks it is." Marcus looked at me for a long time. "She has more than one photograph," he said. "I know. She says the car has been there multiple times. It has. The same person. The same reason. Marcus, I need you to trust me." The word landed wrong. I heard it as soon as I said it. Trust me. The thing people say when they cannot or will not offer proof. The thing that sounds like a reasonable request and functions like a closed door. In 15 years of JAG work, I had listened to 100 people say, "Trust me," from the wrong side of a table, and I had never once found it sufficient. And now I was saying it to my husband and watching his face, and knowing he was doing the math the same way I always did. He didn't say he didn't trust me. He said something worse. He said, "I need some time to think." He slept in the guest room that night. I lay in our bed and stared at the ceiling and did what I always did when I couldn't control a situation. I ran through the facts. What existed? What could be proven? What timeline led to what outcome? The photograph was real. Harry was real. The visits were real. Everything Diane had presented was technically accurate, stripped of its context, which is the oldest and most effective form of lie, not fabrication but curation. She hadn't needed to invent anything. She just needed to show Marcus a window and make sure it faced the wrong direction. I knew how to fight that. I'd fought it in courtrooms. Context is evidence. Sequence is evidence. The question of who was in that car and why is evidence. But I needed the full footage. Not Diane's screenshot, the actual security camera record from the system Marcus had installed on the house 2 years ago, which stored 30 days of continuous footage on a server in the garage that I was fairly certain Diane did not know existed. I thought about that server for a long time in the dark. Then I thought about Derek, Marcus's brother. Practical, fair, the kind of man who fixed things by looking directly at them. He'd been at that dinner 6 weeks ago. He'd seen Diane's comment land. He'd changed the subject because he was kind, but I'd watched his face before he did, and what I'd seen there was not agreement. I picked up my phone. It was past midnight. I texted Derek 4 words, "Can we talk tomorrow?" He replied in under a minute, named the time. I set the phone down and closed my eyes and thought about what my old supervisor used to say. The truth does not protect itself. Tomorrow, I was going to walk it into the room myself. Derek met me at a coffee shop 2 blocks from his office at 7:30 the next morning. He was already there when I arrived, which told me something. Derek was a man who operated on his own schedule, unhurried, rarely early. The fact that he'd beaten me there meant he'd been thinking about my 4-word text since midnight the same way I had. I sat down. He pushed a coffee toward me without asking. I wrapped my hands around it and looked at him and said, "How much has your mother told you?" He said, "Enough that I'm sitting here at 7:30. We understood each other. Derek was 39, 3 years younger than Marcus, with the same broad build and their father's habit of going very still when he was paying close attention. He'd never been Diane's favorite. He'd married Pam, who was loud and warm and took up space in rooms without apologizing for it, and Diane had never quite forgiven him for it. That distance had made him clearer-eyed about his mother than Marcus had ever managed to be. I told him what I could. I told him that the man in the photograph was a colleague, that the visits were work-related, that I could not explain the specifics, but that there was a record. A real, unedited record that would explain everything if Marcus was willing to look at it. Derek listened. Then he said, "The security system. Yes. Marcus doesn't know you know about it. Marcus installed it for the neighborhood watch program 2 years ago and mentioned it once, and forgot about it," I said. I didn't forget. Derek almost smiled. "How long would it take to pull the footage? An hour, maybe less." "I need Marcus in the room and Mom?" I looked at him. He nodded slowly. "She should be there," he said. "It wasn't a question either. If she's going to make an accusation like this in front of my brother, she should be there when the answer comes." I had thought the same thing. I'd thought it at 2 in the morning, lying in my bed, running the sequence the way I ran arguments before trial. You don't win a case by being right in private. You win it by being right in the room where the accusation was made, in front of the people who heard it. Can you get them both there? I said. Tonight, he said. My house. I'll tell Marcus I want to talk through things as a family. He'll come. Mom will come because she thinks she's already won. I thought about that last part for the rest of the day. She thinks she's already won. That was the specific vulnerability I'd been waiting for, and Derek had named it without knowing how precisely it mattered. People who believe they've already won stop being careful. They stop checking their perimeter. They show up to the room where the verdict should be delivered, and they're already composing their acceptance speech in their head. And that composure, that premature certainty, is the thing that makes them visible. I'd seen it in courtrooms. I'd seen it in interrogation rooms. I'd seen it in the faces of people who had done wrong things and had not yet understood that doing a wrong thing and getting away with it are two entirely separate events. I went home that afternoon. I went into the garage. I pulled up the security system on the panel Marcus had mounted to the wall, and I spent 40 minutes learning the interface, which was straightforward, and I located 60 days of stored footage, which was more than I needed, and I found every night that Harry had come to the house. 4 visits over 3 months, each one between 10 and 11:30, each one lasting under 7 minutes, each one showing the same thing. A tall older man in a dark jacket carrying a folder or an envelope, handing it to me at the door, leaving 4 visits, 4 data points. 4 pieces of context that transformed Diane's curated window into a wall with nothing behind it. I copied the relevant segments onto a USB drive. I labeled it with date and precise format I used for evidence logs because some habits are too deep to override. Then I put it in my jacket pocket and I drove to Derek and Pam's house, and I sat in their living room and I waited. Marcus arrived first. He saw me and stopped in the doorway for a moment, not unwilling to come in, just recalibrating. I looked at him and tried to put everything I felt into an expression that wasn't a plea and wasn't a performance. Just my face. Just me. He came in and sat in the chair across from the couch, not beside me, and I noted that, and let it be. Deanne arrived 20 minutes later. She walked in with the specific energy of a woman who has decided the outcome of a meeting before attending it. Coat perfectly buttoned, small smile in place, a fruit tart from the bakery she liked because bringing food was her way of establishing that she was the one being generous here. She saw me, and the smile held for exactly 2 seconds before something behind her eyes shifted. She hadn't expected me to be there. That shift, that microsecond of recalculation, was the first crack, and I filed it the way I filed everything. Derek got everyone seated. Pam brought water, and then positioned herself in the kitchen doorway, which I recognized as a deliberate choice. Present, witnessing, but not crowding the room. I had told her nothing except that it mattered that she stay. She'd said, "I've been waiting for something like this for 3 years. I hadn't asked her to elaborate. Derek said, "Mom, you told Marcus something this week that's caused a real problem in his marriage. Brittney says there's footage that explains what you saw. I think we should look at it." Diane looked at Marcus. "I only told your brother what I saw with my own eyes. I was worried. Any mother would be." "There's a security camera," I said, quietly. Not cutting her off, just placing the fact in the room. "A beat, it records continuously," I said. 30 days of footage. I have 60 because Marcus upgraded the storage last fall. I looked at him when I said that. His jaw moved slightly. "It covers the front of the house, the driveway, and the street, full frame. Time-stamped. I took the USB drive from my pocket and set it on the coffee table. No one spoke. Derek connected it to the television. The footage opened, clean, wide angle, sharper than Diane's screenshot by a factor that made her version look like what it was. A phone camera aimed through a car window in the dark, cropped to remove context, chosen for maximum ambiguity. The first clip played. Harry Svoss walked up the front path, Tall, deliberate, hands behind his back out of old habit. He handed me a manila envelope. We exchanged 12 words. I know because I remembered them exactly, because I remembered everything from those nights. He turned and walked back to his car. Total elapsed time: 4 minutes, 50 seconds. Deanne said, "That doesn't explain." The second clip played, then the third, then the fourth. By the time the fourth clip ended, the room had gone so quiet I could hear the refrigerator in the kitchen. Marcus was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, watching the frozen last frame. Diane had set the fruit tart on the side table and had not touched it. And then the front door opened. I hadn't planned this part. I want to be clear about that. I had not arranged it, had not asked for it, had not known it was coming. Harry Voss had called Derek that afternoon, Derek told me later, and asked if he could stop by. Derek had said yes without telling me because he'd understood, the way perceptive people sometimes do, that the moment needed a witness withstanding. Harry walked into the living room. He was 72 years old, silver-haired, wearing his old navy jacket with the quiet confidence of a man who had long ago stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. He looked at the television. He looked at Marcus. He looked at Diane. Then he looked at me, and his voice was unhurried and entirely certain. The voice of a man reading a name off a commendation he'd signed himself. "Lieutenant Commander Russell," he said. "I'm sorry you had to do this." The room did not make a sound. Marcus turned and looked at me like he was seeing something he recognized from a long time ago and had somehow managed not to notice until this exact moment. And Diane picked up her fruit tart and set it back down and said nothing at all. Nobody moved for a long moment after Harry said my name. Marcus was still leaning forward, elbows on knees, but his eyes had shifted from the television to me. Not with the flat assessment I'd seen in our kitchen 2 nights ago. Something different. Something that was trying to locate me in a map he'd thought he knew. Diane had gone very still. Not the stillness of someone processing new information. The stillness of someone calculating. Harry lowered himself into the armchair Derek indicated, moving with the measured economy of a man whose knees had been through 30 years of shipboard ladders and was not going to apologize for taking his time. He folded his hands in his lap, the same way Marcus had folded his 2 nights ago at our kitchen table, and I thought about how the men in my life had that habit. The folded hands, the waiting. Marcus said, "Lieutenant Commander." "Yes," I said. He said it again, not a question, just the words finding their shape in his mouth. "Lieutenant Commander, JAG Corps," Harry said without flourish. 15 years. She tried cases on 3 continents. She's prosecuted war crimes, contractor fraud, criminal negligence resulting in combat deaths. She is, without exaggeration, one of the finest attorneys I have supervised in 30 years of service. He paused. The visits you saw on that footage were related to a case she has been building for 14 months. I cannot discuss the specifics. What I can tell you is that I drove to your house in the evenings because the documents were classified and could not be transmitted electronically. Every visit lasted under 8 minutes. Your wife behaved with complete professionalism throughout, as she has in every matter I have ever brought to her." He stopped. The room stayed quiet. Derek said, "Brittney, how long?" 15 years active, I said. I joined at 27, and Marcus didn't know. Marcus knew I worked for the government, I said. He knew it involved legal work. He knew there were things I couldn't discuss. I looked at my husband. "I kept more from you than I should have. That's mine to own. But I want you to understand that the reason I didn't tell you had nothing to do with shame or secrecy about who I am. It had to do with a decision I made early, a wrong decision, I think now, to keep 2 parts of my life from touching each other." Marcus looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Why?" 1 word. Not angry, not accusing. Just genuinely asking. And that question, that single honest word, was the one that reached through all of it and found the thing I'd been carrying for 6 years without setting down. I told him about Lieutenant Daniel Prem. I don't talk about Danny often. I've talked about him maybe 4 times in the years since, and each time I've had to locate something in myself that I don't keep near the surface. He was 24 years old. He'd been charged with conduct unbecoming, a charge that was partly procedural and partly political, and mostly the result of a commanding officer who needed someone to absorb the consequences of a decision that had gone wrong at altitude. I was assigned to his case. I built what I thought was a strong defense. I was thorough and I was careful and I was certain we lost. Not because the evidence was against us. It wasn't. We lost because the system is not always a mechanism for finding the truth, and sometimes the people inside it care more about what the verdict costs them than what the truth requires. Danny was discharged. He lost his pension. He went home to Mississippi with a record that made it hard to find work and a story that made it hard to explain himself. 18 months later, he died. An accident ruled accidental. He'd been drinking. His car had left a road in the rain. I've never let myself be certain about what that means. I don't think certainty would be honest. But I've carried the weight of it the way you carry things that don't have clean endings. Not as guilt exactly, but as ballast, as a reason to be careful. As a reminder that being good at something is not the same as being able to protect people with it. When I came home from Danny's memorial, I sat in the apartment I was renting at the time, and I made a decision. I decided that the work was the work, and the life was the life, and that keeping them separate was a way of protecting the life, of preserving something that the work couldn't touch. If I was going to keep doing cases like Danny's, and I was, because I believed in what I did despite what it cost, then I needed something that existed outside of it, something ordinary and real in mine. When I met Marcus, he was that. He was the most purely present person I'd ever encountered. He cared about the project in front of him. He cared about dinner and the weekend and whether the neighbor's tree was going to drop branches on the fence again. He was grounded in a way I didn't know how to be, and I loved that about him completely. And so I made the same decision in our marriage that I'd made in my apartment after Danny's memorial. I kept the work on one side of a wall and the life on the other, and I told myself the wall was protective. I told myself that for 7 years, sitting in Derek's living room, watching my husband's face while I said Danny's name for the first time in front of him, I understood, with the particular clarity that comes too late and still comes, that the wall had not been protecting our life. It had been sitting inside it, taking up space I could have used for truth. Marcus didn't say anything for a long time after I finished. Harry was quiet too. He'd heard parts of the Danny story before, not all of it, and I watched him absorb the parts he hadn't known with the careful attention he'd always brought to things that mattered. Pam had moved from the kitchen doorway to the arm of Derek's chair at some point during the telling. Her hand was on his shoulder. Derek's jaw was set in the way it's set when he was angry about something he hadn't yet found the right shape for. Deanne had not spoken. I made myself look at her. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and her eyes on a point somewhere near the middle of the coffee table, and whatever I'd expected to see in her face, defiance, embarrassment, the particular tightening that happens when someone is reconstructing their position, wasn't there. She looked smaller than she had when she'd walked in. The fruit tart sat untouched on the side table beside her. I thought about Danny. I thought about what it had cost him to be on the wrong side of a story that had already been decided before he walked into the room. I did not feel sorry for Diane, but I noticed the smallness, and I filed it, and I let it be complicated. Marcus reached across the space between his chair and the couch and put his hand on the cushion next to me, not reaching for my hand, just placing his there, an offering, a question. I put my hand over his. Harry looked at us and said nothing, and looked away, which was the most tactful thing I'd ever seen a man do. Outside, the sun had moved while we'd been in that room, and the living room light had shifted from afternoon to something closer to evening, and Derek got up without saying anything and turned on a lamp, and for a moment the 5 of us just sat in the quiet of a room where a great deal had just been said, and the work of figuring out what came next had not yet begun, Deanne left Derek's house before anyone asked her to. She stood up about 10 minutes after I finished talking, gathered her coat with the careful movements of someone's trying to appear composed, picked up the fruit tart, set it back down, and said she needed to get home. Marcus said, "Mom," she said she was tired. She said it had been a long day. She kissed Marcus on the cheek, he let her barely, and she nodded at Derek and did not look at me and walked out. We listened to her car start in the driveway. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Pam said quietly, "Well, and somehow that single syllable contained everything the rest of us were feeling," and Derek made a sound that was almost a laugh, and Harry Voss looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who had survived 30 years of Navy politics and recognized a tactical retreat when he saw one. Marcus drove me home that night. We didn't talk much in the car, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much, and neither of us had found the right door into it yet. He held my hand over the center console. His thumb moved back and forth across my knuckles the way it did when he was thinking. I watched the streetlights pass and felt the particular exhaustion of a day that had required me to be precise and present and controlled for many hours in a row. We were almost home when he said, 15 years. Yes. You've been doing this for 15 years, and I thought you processed contracts. I do process contracts, I said. Occasionally, he made a sound, not quite a laugh. Something that was working toward one. I thought we were through the worst of it. I was wrong. Not about Marcus. Marcus was trying, in the honest, effortful way he always tried at things that mattered. I was wrong about the shape of what was left. Because what I hadn't yet told him, what I hadn't told anyone in that room, what I'd been carrying like a second folder underneath the first, was why Diane had done it, not the surface reason. I understood the surface reason. She'd never liked me. She wanted Marcus closer. She'd found an opportunity and taken it. That was real. That was part of it, but there was a layer underneath that surface, and it had a name and a dollar amount and a file number, and it had been sitting in the back of my mind since the moment Marcus had shown me that photograph 3 nights ago. I'd recognized Diane's behavior too precisely. I'd understood her tactics too well. And somewhere in the 14 months I'd spent building the contractor fraud case, the 9-figure graft operation, the overbilling, the inferior equipment shipped to units in the field. I had reviewed a list of subcontractors and vendors, a long list, hundreds of entries. Companies I'd had to research, verify, cross-reference against disbursement records and delivery logs. One of those companies was called DGR Supply Solutions. DGR, Diane Grace Russell. Her maiden name was Grace. I had flagged it 14 months ago and set it aside. The irregularities were small compared to the central fraud, and the company appeared to be a peripheral vendor, not a direct participant. But it had been flagged. It was in my notes. And the lead prosecutor who'd taken over the case from me had the same notes. I hadn't put it together with Diane, not consciously, not at first. She'd mentioned her supply business to me once, 2 years into my marriage, in passing, the way she mentioned most things about herself. As a statement of fact that didn't invite questions. I'd filed it somewhere unreachable and left it there. But the week before, she'd shown Marcus the photograph. The week of those 3 phone calls. The week Marcus had taken that 3rd call in the bedroom and come out with his careful deciding face. That was the same week I'd learned. The prosecutors had expanded their vendor review. I hadn't thought about Diane in connection with it. I'd been too deep in the work, too close to the end of it. Now, lying in our bed that night while Marcus slept with his hand still finding mine under the covers, I thought about it. I ran the timeline. Diane had started building her case against me 8 months ago. Around the time the initial investigation had become less quiet. Around the time certain vendors had received notices of audit. She might have heard something. She might have known someone who'd heard something. She might not have known it was me specifically on the case. She almost certainly didn't know that. But she might have understood that someone was looking. And she might have decided, with the particular instinct of someone who has something to hide, that removing me from the picture was a form of insurance. Not because she knew I was investigating her, because she was afraid of what I might find if I ever looked. That distinction mattered. In law, it matters enormously. The difference between targeted obstruction and preemptive self-protection is the difference between certain charges and possible ones. But sitting in my own bedroom at 2 a.m, it mattered to me for a different reason. Deanne hadn't come after me because she knew who I was. She'd come after me because she'd sensed something about me that she couldn't name and couldn't afford to be wrong about. Some instinct had told her I was dangerous, and she'd acted on that instinct without understanding it, the way people do when fear outruns information. She hadn't known she was poking a 15-year JAG attorney with a classified case file on her desk. She'd just known she was afraid. I lay in the dark and thought about what I was going to do with this. The legal obligation was clear. I had notes. The prosecutors had the file. If DGR Supply Solutions surfaced in their expanded review, and based on what I knew, they would find it without my help. My role in the case was concluded. I had no obligation to actively surface information about my mother-in-law's company. I also had no ethical right to suppress it. But there was a third question, which was what I was going to tell Marcus. He deserved to know. Not as ammunition. I had no interest in using this against Diane, not because she hadn't earned it, but because using it that way would make it about winning. And I had spent 15 years learning the difference between winning and justice. He deserved to know because it was the truth, and the truth was the thing I'd been keeping from him for too long in too many forms. I decided I would tell him in the morning, and then I decided I would give it one more day. Not out of cowardice. I examined that possibility carefully and rejected it. But because some truths need to be placed in the right moment, and the right moment was not 2 a.m. after the longest week of our marriage. The next morning, Marcus made coffee and brought mine to me without asking how I took it, because he'd known how I took it for 7 years, and that small ordinary fact made my chest ache in a way I hadn't expected. I sat across from him at our kitchen table, the same table where he'd shown me the photograph, the same 2 chairs, the same morning light, and I told him about DGR Supply Solutions. I told him about the audit notices. I told him about the timeline. I told him what I believed his mother had understood, and what she hadn't, and what it meant. Marcus set his coffee cup down. He sat with it for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "She did all of this because she was scared of getting caught." "That's what I think," I said. "I can't prove the connection." But yes, he looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked up at me. "Brittney," he said, "I am so sorry." Marcus's apology was real. I want to say that clearly because what came after it was hard, and I don't want the hardness to obscure the realness of that moment. He sat across from me at our kitchen table in the morning light, and he said he was sorry with his whole face, not just his words, and I believed him completely. But an apology, however genuine, is not the same as a resolution. It's a beginning. It's the moment when 2 people agree that something went wrong and decide to stay in the room together and figure out what to do about it. What comes after the apology is the actual work, and the actual work is harder than the apology by a factor that nobody warns you about adequately. We spent 3 days in that kitchen. Not literally. We went to work, we slept. We moved through the ordinary architecture of our lives. But every important conversation happened at that table, with coffee going cold between us and the morning light shifting to afternoon and back again. Marcus asked questions, real ones, not the performing understanding kind, but the kind that meant he was actually trying to build a new map of who I was and where I'd been for 15 years. He asked about Danny. He asked about the cases I could describe in general terms without violating anything. He asked what a JAG attorney actually did day to day, and I told him, and he listened with the focused attention he gave to structural problems, looking for the load-bearing elements, the places where things connected. He asked why I'd never trusted him with it. I told him the truth, which was that it hadn't been about trust. It had been about preservation, about wanting something in my life that existed outside the weight of the work. He sat with that for a while, and then he said he understood it. And then he said he wished I'd let him make that choice himself, whether he wanted to carry some of it instead of making it for him. That was the hardest thing he said in those 3 days. Not the hardest to hear, the hardest because he was right. On the 4th day, Marcus called his mother. I wasn't in the room. He went to the backyard, the same place we'd been standing when I'd thought, this is enough. This right here. And he was out there for 45 minutes. I sat at the kitchen table and drank my coffee and did not trust this, which required more discipline than most things I'd done that week. When he came back in, he sat down across from me and said, "She denies the DGR connection." "I know she will," I said. "She says the company is legitimate. She says she doesn't know anything about any audit. She may not know about the audit specifically," I said. "She would have received a standard vendor review notice. Those don't always use the word audit." Marcus looked at his hands. "She says you've always had it out for her." I looked at him. "I know," he said. "I know." He pressed his fingers against his forehead. "She also said, and this is the part I've been sitting with, she said she did what she did because she loves me and she was worried." "I know that's what she believes," I said. "Is there a difference between believing it and it being true?" "Yes," I said. "There's a significant difference. People do harmful things for loving reasons all the time. The love doesn't undo the harm. It just makes it more complicated." He looked at me for a moment. "You sound like a lawyer." "I am a lawyer, I know." Something in his face shifted. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. I'm still getting used to that. The confrontation I'd been preparing for didn't happen the way I'd imagined it. I'd imagined something formal. A meeting. A table. Diane and Marcus and me, and perhaps Derek. Evidence laid out. Position stated. What I'd built toward in the weeks of careful thinking, the way I always built toward a proceeding. What actually happened was smaller and stranger and more true. Deanne came to our house on a Saturday morning, unannounced, which was her habit and which I had always disliked and which Marcus had always defended as just how she was. She knocked, and Marcus answered, and I heard their voices in the entryway, hers bright and careful, his careful in a different way. And then they came into the kitchen, where I was sitting with my laptop and a second cup of coffee. She looked at me the way she'd looked at the coffee table in Derek's living room, at something near me, not quite at me. Marcus pulled out a chair for her. She sat. I closed my laptop. For a moment no one said anything. Then Diane said, "I owe you an apology, Brittney." I waited. "I should not have gone to Marcus with what I saw without talking to you first." I handled it poorly. I studied her face. The apology was technically accurate and emotionally insufficient and precisely calibrated to acknowledge the minimum required to restore a surface peace. I'd heard that category of apology before. I knew its architecture, the careful passive construction, the I should not have rather than I was wrong, the focus on method rather than intent. But I also knew something else. I knew that Diane was 68 years old and had built her sense of self around a particular story about her family, and that story had just been substantially revised in a room full of people who loved her son more than they deferred to her. I knew that she was frightened, in a way that had nothing to do with me, about things that were moving toward her that she couldn't control. And I knew that people in that position often cannot produce a better apology than the one she'd just given, not because they don't know it's insufficient, but because a better one would require them to see themselves clearly, and that kind of seeing is the hardest thing there is. I thought about Danny Prem. I thought about what it had cost him to be in a room where the verdict was already written before he arrived. I did not think Diane deserved the same compassion Danny had deserved. I want to be precise about that. What happened to Danny was done to him. What Diane had done, she had chosen. The situations were not the same, but I was 42 years old, and I had spent 15 years in rooms where people's worst choices were the central subject, and I had learned, slowly at significant cost, that holding on to other people's wrongs was its own kind of weight. Not for their sake. For mine. I looked at Diane across my kitchen table. I said, I accept your apology, not. It's fine, not. Don't worry about it. Not any of the phrases that would have let her off the hook and erased what had happened. Just, I accept it. Which meant I have heard it, and I am choosing not to carry it, and we both know it was not enough. And we are going to live in that knowledge together. Diane looked at me then. Really looked at me. For possibly the first time, something in her face moved that I couldn't entirely name. Not remorse exactly. Not relief. Something that was trying to become one of those things and hadn't finished yet. Marcus put his hand on the table between us, not reaching for either of us. Just placing it there. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something. A car passed on the street. The refrigerator made its small sound in the corner of the kitchen. The world, as it always does, kept moving anyway. 2 weeks after Diane came to our kitchen, Harry called me. I was in the car parked outside a grocery store, the engine still running, when my phone lit up with his name. I answered on the second ring, which was habit. Harry didn't call without a reason, and his reasons were always worth the second ring. He said, I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear it from me before you hear it from anyone else. I turned off the engine. The expanded vendor review had surfaced DGR Supply Solutions. Not as a central player, Harry was careful about what he could tell me, and I was careful about what I asked. But as a flagged peripheral contractor with irregular billing patterns across 3 fiscal years, the amount involved was not catastrophic. It was not 9 figures. It was the kind of number that gets someone a serious conversation and a significant fine and possibly worse, depending on what the review turned up and what the prosecutors decided to do with it. Harry said, You're clean on this. Your notes flagged it correctly and appropriately, and you concluded your role before any of this expanded. Nobody is looking at you. I know, I said. I wanted you to hear it anyway. I sat in the parking lot for a while after we hung up. A woman walked past with a cart full of groceries, a toddler balanced on her hip, talking to someone on her phone in a voice that carried through my closed window. A man in a delivery uniform jogged past in the other direction. Ordinary Saturday afternoon, the world doing what it does. I thought about how to tell Marcus. I'd already told him about DGR. He knew the shape of it, Diane's company, the audit notices, the timeline that suggested fear rather than malice with full information. What I now had to tell him was that the shape had become something more concrete. That the thing I'd described as a possibility had moved into the territory of a proceeding. I called him before I went into the store. I stood by my car in the parking lot, and I told him what Harry had told me, keeping carefully to what I actually knew rather than what I suspected. The way I always tried to do. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Does she know yet? I don't know. Probably not officially. Okay, he said. His voice was steady in the specific way it got when he was absorbing something structural, the way he sounded when a building inspector found something unexpected and he was already calculating the remediation. Okay. Thank you for telling me. I'll always tell you, I said. That's what I should have been doing from the beginning, he said. Yeah, and then, after a pause, go get the groceries. I'll start dinner. I stood in the cereal aisle for longer than necessary that evening, not because I couldn't find what I was looking for, but because I needed the ordinary hum of the store around me. Fluorescent light and shopping carts and piped-in music and strangers deciding between 2 brands of the same thing. I needed the world to be regular for a few minutes. I thought about what was coming for Diane. I didn't let myself feel satisfied about it. I didn't let myself feel sorry about it either. I let it be what it was, a consequence moving at its own pace through its own channels, toward its own conclusion, and I let that be enough. What happened next, I hadn't anticipated. Derek called me 3 days later. He'd been talking to some of Harry's former colleagues, he said. I wasn't sure how that had happened. Derek in conversation with retired Navy officers was not a combination I'd have predicted. But Derek had always had a way of finding the right people in any room and making them want to talk to him. He'd been asking questions the way he did, carefully and without agenda. 3 of Harry's former colleagues had served in units that I had directly supported as JAG counsel. One of them was a man named Chief Petty Officer Raymond Okafor, retired, who had been the senior's enlisted advisor in a case I'd handled 8 years ago. A procurement fraud case. 3 soldiers had nearly died because of equipment that had been certified as functional and wasn't. I'd prosecuted the contractor and won, and the judgment had resulted in a complete overhaul of the certification process for that equipment category. Chief Okafor had been one of the people in the room when that verdict came in. He called me on a Thursday evening. I didn't recognize the number, and I almost didn't answer. And then I did, because something about the area code felt familiar in the way that certain numbers do when you've spent enough time in enough different places. He said, "Commander Russell, my name is Raymond Okafor. I don't know if you remember me. I remembered him. I told him so. He said, I heard there was some trouble with your family. People saying things that weren't true?" He paused. "I wanted you to know, if you ever needed someone to speak to what you've done, what you actually did, in rooms most people never hear about. I'd consider it an honor." I sat down on the edge of our bed. Marcus was downstairs. I could hear the television. I said, "Chief Okafor." "That means more than I can tell you," he said. "You brought our people home, Commander. Not in a box." A pause. "The least I can do is say so when it matters." We talked for 20 minutes. He told me he'd been in contact with 2 other veterans from cases I'd handled. Men and women who had been on the right side of verdicts that had gone the right way, who had heard, through the informal network that exists among people who've served together, that someone had tried to damage my name. He said they wanted me to know they were there, that if anyone needed to understand who Brittney Russell was and what she'd spent 15 years doing, there were people who could say it from direct experience. I told him I was okay. That the immediate situation had resolved. He said, "Good, but the offer stands." After I hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed for a while without moving. Marcus came upstairs and found me there and sat down beside me without asking why I was sitting in the dark, which was one of the things I loved most about him. His willingness to simply be in a room with me without requiring an explanation for what the room contained. I told him about Chief Okafor, about the 2 others, about the informal network of people who had apparently decided, without being asked, to position themselves as witnesses to my life. Marcus listened. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 15 years? Yes. 15 years of that. And you came home and asked me about my work. Your work is interesting, I said. Brittney, Marcus. He put his arm around me. I leaned into him the way I had for 7 years, in the specific way that his shoulder fit, which was one of those small physical facts of a long marriage that you stop noticing until you're in danger of losing it, and then you notice nothing else. "I want to meet them," he said. "Chief Okafor, Harry, all of them. You've met Harry properly. I want to meet them properly. I want to know who you are out there." I looked at the dark window across from us. The neighbor's porch light was on. A car moved past on the street below. "Okay," I said. "I'd like that too." And somewhere across town, I knew, Diane was sitting with a letter she hadn't opened yet, or a phone call she hadn't returned, or a conversation she was calculating how to have, moving towards something she couldn't redirect. I didn't think about that with satisfaction. I thought about it the way I thought about most inevitable things, as weather, as the particular kind of consequence that doesn't need anyone's help arriving. What I thought about instead was Marcus's shoulder and Chief Okafor's voice. And the fact that on a Thursday evening in my own bedroom, I had felt something I hadn't expected to feel in the middle of all of this, held. That was the word for it, held by people who had decided, without being asked, that I was worth showing up for. The letter from the Federal Contractor Review Office arrived at Diane's house on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after Harry's call. I knew this because Marcus told me. He'd been in more contact with his mother since everything had surfaced. Not warm contact, not the easy Sunday calls of before, but deliberate, careful contact, the kind that two people maintain when they understand that the relationship between them has been fundamentally revised, and neither of them is sure yet what the new version looks like. He called her on Tuesdays. She called him on Thursdays. They talked about small things, mostly the garden, the weather, a home repair she needed done. The larger things sat between them like furniture neither of them had agreed to move. When the letter arrived, she called him immediately. He came home that evening and sat across from me at the kitchen table. Always the kitchen table. That table had become the place where true things happened in our house, and told me she'd received a formal notice of civil investigation related to DGR Supply Solutions. Irregular billing patterns across 3 government contracts. A request for documentation. A deadline. He said she'd asked if I had anything to do with it. I looked at him. I told her no, he said. I told her you'd concluded your role in the case before any of this expanded, and that you hadn't flagged her company specifically to anyone. He paused. That's true, right? That's true, I said. My notes flagged it as a peripheral irregularity consistent with standard review criteria. I didn't pursue it. I didn't direct anyone to pursue it. It surfaced on its own in an expanded review. Marcus nodded slowly. She doesn't believe that. I know. She thinks you did it deliberately. I know. Did you want to? He said. Not accusing, genuinely asking. I thought about it honestly, the way I tried to think about things that deserved honesty. There was a moment, I said, when I knew about DGR and knew what it might mean, when I thought about what she'd done to us. And I felt something. But wanting a consequence and engineering one are different things. I've spent 15 years learning that difference. Marcus looked at his hands. She's going to need a lawyer. She is. A good one. She is, I said again. He looked up at me. Something in his face was asking a question he hadn't found the words for yet. I can give her names, I said. Good civilian attorneys who handle federal contractor cases. I won't represent her. That's not ethically possible. But I can make sure she has access to someone competent. He was quiet for a moment. Why would you do that? Because she's your mother, I said. And because she deserves a fair process. Everyone does. That's not a feeling, Marcus. That's what I believe down to my bones. It's why I do the work. He looked at me for a long time. Then he got up and came around the table and sat in the chair beside me instead of across from me, which was not something he usually did. And he took my hand. I keep thinking, he said, about the version of this where I'd believed her. Where I'd come home and said, I want a divorce. I don't want to hear your explanation. I've made up my mind. Where I'd never looked at the footage. He shook his head. She almost had me there. She was close. I know, I said. That terrifies me more than anything else about this. It should, I said, not because of what it says about you. It says that you loved your mother and she exploited that. But because it's a reminder of how easy it is, how close the good and the bad outcome can be. A half step in one direction. He squeezed my hand. I'm sorry I didn't ask more questions. I'm sorry I made asking feel unnecessary, I said. I made a closed room and then was surprised when you couldn't see inside it. We sat like that for a while. The evening moved around us. 3 weeks after the letter, Diane asked Marcus to come to her house. She'd retained an attorney. Not from my list. She hadn't taken my list, which I understood. And she'd had the first round of conversations about what cooperation looked like and what it cost and what the realistic outcomes were. Marcus came home from that visit quieter than usual, with the look he got when he'd been in a room where something heavy had been said and he was still carrying it. He told me she'd acknowledged it. Not in a legal sense. Her attorney had been present and the conversation had been carefully framed, but in the way that matters between people who know each other. She'd admitted that she had billed inconsistently across the contracts. She'd admitted that she'd known it wasn't right. She'd said she'd told herself it was minor, that everyone did it, that the amounts were small relative to the whole. Marcus had asked her, Did she understand that people in the field sometimes didn't have what they needed because money had been redirected? She hadn't answered directly, but she'd looked at her hands, and Marcus said that look was its own kind of answer. He said, "She asked about you." "What did she ask?" "She asked if you were going to be okay. With all of it." He paused. "I think she meant, were you going to be okay with her?" With the relationship, I looked at the window. Evening light. The neighbor's porch light coming on automatically, the way it always did at this hour. "I told her you were the one who offered to find her a lawyer," he said. She didn't say anything for a long time. And then she said, "I misjudged her." 3 words. Not an apology. Not even close to an apology for everything that needed apologizing for. But something. I thought about what it had taken her to say that. I thought about what it costs a person to revise a story they've been telling themselves for years, about who they are, about who the people around them are, about the narrative that makes their choices make sense. I knew something about that cost. I'd been revising my own story for weeks. I didn't call Diane. I didn't write to her. I let the space between us be what it was. Not hostile, not warm, not resolved, honest. An honest distance that might, over time and with care, become something else. Or might not. I was done pretending to certainty I didn't have. What I did was call Derek. I told him I appreciated what he'd done. Bringing Harry in. Facilitating. Being a fair witness when fairness was the thing most needed in that room. He said, "You would have found a way without me." I said, "Maybe. But it would have taken longer and cost more." He said, "That's basically my value proposition on every job site." I laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed in weeks, and it felt like something loosening. Pam got on the phone and talked to me for 40 minutes about a home renovation they were planning, and I answered all her questions with genuine interest, and by the end of the call I felt like myself, in a way I hadn't in longer than I could precisely identify. Some things come back slowly. Some things come back in pieces. Some things come back through the small, ordinary channels. A phone call, a laugh, a Tuesday evening at a kitchen table with the right person across from you. Marcus made dinner that night. He burned the first batch, as he always did, and blamed the pan, as he always did, and I sat on the counter and watched him start over and thought, "This is enough. This right here. Still. After everything, still enough. A year is a long time and not a long time. It's long enough to watch a season come around again and recognize it differently than you did before. Long enough to have the same arguments about the same small things and understand that the smallness of them is not a failure but a gift. Long enough to rebuild something that was damaged and learn the rebuilt version in the specific way you learn things the second time. Slower, more deliberately, with a sharper awareness of what you're touching and why it matters. It is not long enough to forget. I don't think that's what time is for, despite what people say. I think time is for integration, for taking the thing that happened and finding where it fits in the larger shape of who you are, so it stops being a wound and becomes something closer to a watermark, still there, visible at certain angles. Part of the paper now, Marcus and I are okay. I want to say that plainly before I say anything else. We are okay in a way that is different from how we were before, and I have come to believe that different does not mean lesser. We talk more. That sounds simple, and it is not simple. 15 years of a particular silence is a habit with deep roots, and pulling it up takes time and leaves a mess, and some mornings I still catch myself editing before I speak, removing the classified, the complicated, the things I've always filed under not worth explaining. When I catch myself doing it, I try to say the unedited version instead. Marcus has learned to ask questions, and I have learned to treat the questions as the gift they are rather than the intrusion they used to feel like. We had dinner with Harry Voss in the spring. His wife Eleanor made pot roast and apologized for it the entire meal, which was unnecessary because it was excellent. Marcus and Harry talked for 3 hours about things I'd had no idea they'd have in common. Marcus's structural engineering work, Harry's early postings at installations that Marcus recognized from blueprints he'd once consulted on, The particular pleasure two precise men take in discovering a shared language. I sat across the table and watched my husband and one of my oldest colleagues find each other, and I felt something I didn't have a word for exactly. Completion, maybe. The right things finally in the same room. Chief Okafor came to dinner too, in the early summer. He brought his wife and his youngest daughter, who was 17 and who asked me more direct questions about JAG work in 90 minutes than Marcus had asked in 7 years, which made Marcus laugh and made me think that the right questions are a form of respect if they come from the right place. Deanne's case resolved in the fall. A civil settlement, no criminal charges, a repayment agreement, a period of debarment from federal contracting. Her attorney had done solid work. The outcome was proportionate to what she'd done, which is the most you can ask of any process. I know this because proportionate outcomes require work from everyone involved, and I've seen enough disproportionate ones to understand how unusual the right result actually is. She and Marcus are rebuilding. Carefully, with more honesty than they had before, which I think is worth something even when honesty is painful. She came to our house for dinner in November, just the three of us, her idea, which cost her something to suggest and cost me something to agree to. We sat at the kitchen table and talked for 2 hours about things that were not the thing, and then briefly, near the end, about the thing itself. She said she'd been afraid. I said I knew. She's fear had made her do something she couldn't fully explain. I said I understood that too. We are not close. I don't know if we will be. I've stopped trying to predict it and started trying to be honest in each individual moment we share, which is the only unit of relationship I've found I can actually manage. What I know is that I am 43 years old, and I have spent 16 years doing work that I believe in, and that has cost me things I couldn't have anticipated when I started. I have stood in rooms where the truth was inconvenient and stayed there anyway. I have lost cases I should have won and won cases that took everything I had. I have carried a young man named Danny Prem in the back of my mind for 8 years, and I have let that weight teach me things instead of just making me tired. I am, as Harry once told a room full of people, a lieutenant commander in the JAG Corps. I process government contracts occasionally. I do other things too. Marcus asked me once, not long after everything settled, what my call sign was. JAG attorneys don't have call signs the way pilots do. It's not that kind of work. But in the informal culture of the Corps, particularly among the attorneys who handle the cases that don't make news, there are names, informal ones. The kind that attach themselves to you without your permission and mean something about how the people you've worked with see you. Mine is Ledger. He asked me why. I told him what Harry had explained to me years ago when the name had first started following me around. A ledger is a record. It holds debits and credits both. What's owed, what's been paid, what the balance is. It doesn't make judgments about which column is longer. It just keeps the account accurately, because accuracy is what the whole system rests on, Harry had said. That's what you do, Russell. You keep the account accurate, even when it costs you, especially then. I'd argued with him about it at the time. I'd said there were plenty of attorneys who could keep an accurate record. He'd said yes, but not everyone could do it in a room where the record was inconvenient to everyone present and still not change a number. I think about that sometimes, about what it means to be accurate in rooms that are asking you to round, to add things up honestly when the honest sum is not the one anyone wanted. I think that's the thing I'd want to pass on if I were the kind of person who passed things on. Not the cases, not the titles or the clearances or the years. Just that, stay accurate. In the rooms that matter, in the rooms that cost you, in the rooms where someone is waiting for you to flinch and you decide, one more time, that you won't. Marcus understands Ledger now. I know because he used it once, quietly, a few weeks after I explained it, when we were in the middle of one of the harder conversations we've been learning to have. He said, I need you to be Ledger right now. Tell me the actual number. I told him the actual number. We were okay after. We are okay now. A year is a long time and not a long time. The seasons come back around. The neighbor's dog still barks at nothing. Marcus still burns the first batch and blames the pan. Harry's wife still apologizes for excellent pot roast. The world keeps moving, and some mornings, standing at my own kitchen window with coffee going warm in my hands and my husband's voice coming from the other room, I think about the ledger, about what's in it, about what it cost and what it came to. And I think the account is accurate, and I think that's enough. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been misjudged in a room where the verdict felt decided, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're watching from somewhere in the world tonight, tell me where. Drop your country and your local time in the comments. I read everyone.